The dry wind blew dust across the New Mexico plains, rattling the shutters of the grand ranch house that sat like a lonely crown atop a barren hill. Eleanor Remington stood at her window, her gloved hands resting against the frame, watching the dying fields below. The cattle were thin. The soil was cracked. And her ranch hands, those who hadn't already left, were growing restless. It had been nearly a year since her husband, Jonathan Remington, had died suddenly of a fever that swept through the territory. His passing left Eleanor a widow at 32 and sole master of the vast Remington Ranch, a once vibrant home, now quiet and heavy with absence. She was known in town as the widow on the hill. Some said it with sympathy, others with spite. Eleanor had always been a proud woman, educated, refined, and strong-willed. She and Jonathan had built the ranch together from nothing, but his name had opened doors. Without him, she found herself surrounded by doubters. Bankers gave her tight smiles. Men offered to buy her land at a fraction of its worth. Suitors knocked at her door more often than neighbors, but none came offering help-only ownership. She refused to be pitied or owned. Now, with most of her workers gone, only a handful remained. Her ranch manager, old Tom Halberd, was loyal but worn down. "You need to hire more men, Ellie," he urged again that morning, holding his weathered hat in both hands. "The herd's slipping through our fingers. If you don't bring in hands, before branding season, we'll lose everything. I won't have strangers living in my barn, getting drunk on my dime and running off with calves in the night," she replied sharply. "I've had enough of men who think me soft because I wear a skirt." Tom left with a sigh, mumbling something about pride and ruin. Eleanor was too tired to argue. She turned her attention back to her ledgers, her tea gone cold beside her. Afternoon, the knock came at the side door, soft, hesitant. When she opened it, the sunlight spilled over the form of a man who looked like he'd walked straight out of a war and into her yard. He was tall, towering, even broad-shouldered, and thick with muscle, though he carried himself like a man used to shrinking from notice. His face was angular, sharp, with faded scars across his cheek and jaw. His skin was dark from sun and heritage, Apache. He wore threadbare trousers, no boots, and a faded army coat over his bare chest. His long black hair was braided, but tangled with dust and wind. His eyes met hers with quiet resolve. "I heard you need men," he said simply. His voice was deep, raspy, and calm. "I'll work. I don't need pay, just food, a place to sleep." Eleanor stepped back instinctively. Everything about him set off alarms. Tall, Apache, stranger. She gripped the edge of the door frame. "What's your name?" she asked, not opening the door further. "Taza." "You have references, Taza?" He shook his head once. "No, I work. I don't steal. I don't drink. I fix fences, cut timber, brand cattle. I can protect your boy." The mention of her son made her stiffen. Caleb was all she had left. "Who told you I had a son?" He looked toward the tree near the porch, where Caleb's worn-out slingshot leaned. "I listen." She didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone. But something about the way he stood, like a man asking for mercy, but too proud to beg, gave her pause. She saw no hunger in his eyes for her land, her house, or her gold. Only work, purpose. Still, she was ready to send him on his way. "Until?" He added one more thing. "I can give you children too," he said. The words hit her like cold water. She blinked, stunned. "Excuse me? You're young," he said, without shame. "A woman like you should have more children. You shouldn't be alone. I can give you that if you want. Or not, I'll still work." She almost slammed the door in his face, but did in single quotes T. Instead, she stared. He said it like an offering, not a bargain. As if that kind of thing was just another chore on a ranch. She didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she said, You'll sleep in the barn. You start at sunup. You break my fence. You're gone. You so much as frighten my son. You're gone." He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." As she closed the door, she leaned against it, heart pounding, breath shallow. She had just hired a giant, Apache stranger who offered to fix her ranch and give her another child. Eleanor wasn't sure what shocked her more, that he'd said it, or that a small part of her hadn't minded hearing it. The morning sun cast a golden haze over the parched land as Eleanor Remington stood at the edge of her porch, arms folded, watching the barn where the tall Apache now slept. His arrival, the day before, had left her shaken more from her reaction than his offer. "I can give you children, too." The words still echoed in her mind. Not lustful, not demanding, just honest, blunt. A statement of fact, as if offering to fix her fence or mend a saddle. And that made it worse somehow. She wasn't a woman who welcomed such intimacy from anyone, especially not from a man she didn't know. But here he was already hard at work before dawn, shirt off in the sun, lifting broken fence posts like matchsticks. He moved with quiet power, never asking for instructions. Caleb, her son, watched from behind the chicken coop, wide-eyed but unafraid. Tom Halbert leaned on the porch railing beside her. "You sure about this, Ellie?" he asked. "The men are talking. Folks in town won't like it either." Eleanor kept her gaze steady. "They didn't offer to fix my fences or protect my son." "He did." Tom sighed, then tipped his hat. "He's a big one. Strong, but quiet, like a wolf watching its pack from the shadows." "Then maybe I'll finally sleep through the night." Inside the house, Eleanor laid out rules in her head. Boundaries. Distance. The man worked well, but he wasn't to become part of her home. He was a hired hand, nothing more. She told herself that again and again. Later that week, she called him to the porch. Taza came immediately, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. His chest was streaked with dust and sun, but his expression remained calm and respectful. "We need to be clear," Eleanor said. "You work here, that's all. You sleep in the barn, you eat outside. You do your chores, and you leave my son alone unless I say otherwise. Is that understood?" He nodded slowly. "Yes." "And that thing you said about children." She swallowed, forcing herself to keep her voice even. "That was inappropriate. Don't speak to me like that again." Taza met her eyes. "I won't say it again. Unless you ask." He turned and walked off, not waiting for a response. Eleanor's face burned with something between indignation and intrigue. The days passed. Taza worked with tireless precision. He repaired fence lines, cleared brush, and patched the sagging roof on the shed. When a calf went missing, he found it before nightfall. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. He never entered the house, never sat on her porch uninvited, and Caleb, he started to watch him more openly. Then one day, Eleanor found them together in the pasture, Caleb handing Taza a rock, and Taza showing him how to skip it across the surface of the creek. She marched out, ready to scold them both. But before she could speak, Taza stepped back and tipped his head slightly. He asked to learn. "I didn't touch him." Eleanor hesitated, her anger caught in her throat. Caleb beamed up at her. "Mama, he showed me how to track rabbits. He knows everything." Eleanor's shoulders sagged. She couldn't remember the last time her son had smiled like that. That night, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, staring at a cup of tea she didn't drink. Her hand trembled slightly as she remembered her husband's voice, deep and kind, calling her Elle as he held her close on cold nights. She missed that warmth. She missed not feeling afraid. She went to the window and saw Taza outside by the barn, sitting by the fire pit, his legs crossed, carving something from wood. The fire lit his face in flickering amber. He looked calm, distant, but grounded. A man who needed little and asked for less. She opened the door. "Taza," she called. He looked up. "I have stew. There's extra." He stood, then paused. "You?" "Sure." She nodded once. He ate quietly at the kitchen table while she fed. Caleb. The silence between them was strange, but not uncomfortable. Eleanor studied him without meaning to. The way he held the spoon with surprising gentleness. The way he waited until Caleb had finished speaking before responding as they cleaned up. She said, "You were a warrior once." Taza nodded. "Yes. Now." "You fix fences." "Yes. Why here?" Taza looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because you looked like someone who had no one left." Her breath caught, heart thudding in her chest. She turned away, voice soft. "Finish your stew and head back to the barn." He stood and left without another word. As the screen door creaked shut, Eleanor leaned against the counter, hand on her chest. She didn't know whether to feel insulted or seen and she wasn't sure which frightened her more. The morning sun warmed the hills as spring began to stir life back into the land. Green buds pushed through the hardened soil, and the air no longer carried the bite of winter. But the greatest shift wasn't in the weather, it was inside the Remington household. Eleanor noticed it first in the way her son, Caleb, lingered at the barn after chores. The boy had always been quiet since his father died, too quiet for an 8-year-old with such bright eyes. But now there was laughter. Not loud or wild, just a small, curious kind that bubbled up when he thought no one was watching. She found him kneeling beside the tall Apache, both of them squatting in the dirt, examining a long trail of tiny footprints. "What is it?" Caleb asked. Taza didn't answer right away. He dipped his fingers in the soil, brushing the edge of the print. "Jackrabbit. 2 of them, one older, one younger." "How do you know?" Taza tapped one print. "This one's deeper, worn pads, heavy. This one's light. Clumsy steps, like a child learning to run." Caleb's face lit with wonder. "Can you teach me how to see that?" Taza gave the smallest nod. "If you're willing to be still and quiet." Caleb threw a glance at his mother standing on the porch, unsure if he'd be scolded. But Eleanor only turned back toward the house, pretending she hadn't heard. Something told her this, whatever it was between them, needed space to grow. That afternoon, Eleanor found herself peering out the window far more often than she cared to admit. Her son followed Taza like a shadow, carrying wood, leading the mule, even trying to mimic. The man's wide, grounded stride. At first, it unsettled her. Caleb had clung to her for months after Jonathan's death, waking with nightmares and refusing to play. She feared what might happen if the Apache left or disappointed him. But each day, her son came home suntanned and smiling, eager to tell her what he had learned: how to fish with his hands, how to move without startling birds, how to listen for danger in the wind. "He says wind has voices," Caleb whispered over supper. "Not like people do, but like stories." Eleanor had nearly dropped her spoon. She hadn't heard Caleb speak so poetically since Jonathan used to tell bedtime stories. One night, after Caleb had gone to bed, Eleanor stepped out into the yard, the lantern casting a warm ring of light around. Her boots. She found Taza kneeling beside the grave under the cottonwood tree, Jonathan's grave. He didn't speak as she approached. He had placed a smooth river stone on the grave and a bundle of sage beside it. His head was bowed. Eleanor's voice was cool. "What are you doing?" Taza didn't look at her. Respecting him. This was his land, his wife, his son. A flicker of unease passed through her. "You didn't know him." "I didn't have to." Taza finally looked up, his voice low. "I see what he left behind." Eleanor stood in silence. No one else had ever done that. Not the neighbors, not the bankers, not the suitors who came sniffing for her hand. None of them had ever acknowledged Jonathan, or what losing him had done to her. And this man, this outsider, had said more in 5 words than they ever had. The next day, Caleb came running into the kitchen. "Mama, look!" In his hands was a small wooden figure, a bear. Rough, simple, carved by hand. "Taza made it for me," he said it strong and quiet, like him. Eleanor examined the carving. "Did you thank him?" "Yes, I told him he should stay forever." Eleanor's heart thudded. She knelt and gently brushed Caleb's hair back. "Why do you like him so much?" Caleb shrugged. "He doesn't talk much, but he listens. He doesn't make me feel like I'm broken." Her throat tightened. Out of the mouths of babes the truth always rang loudest. That night Eleanor couldn't sleep. The wind whispered outside, brushing against the windows like a breath. She thought of Jonathan, of what they'd built together, then of the man sleeping in the barn who never once asked for anything, yet slowly filled the cracks in her home. She rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped out into the cool night. From the barn, faint snoring echoed deep and even. Caleb's bear lay on the porch rail, left behind in his excitement. Eleanor held it, staring at the little carving. "He listens. He doesn't make me feel like I'm broken." She didn't know what frightened her more, that her son had said it, or that she felt the same. The wind shifted before the clouds rolled in. An eerie hush fell over the Remington ranch like the breath of something ancient. Birds flew low, and the cattle grew restless. Taza stood in the pasture, eyes on the horizon, where black thunderclouds built like mountains. He didn't speak, but he moved with purpose, gathering tools, securing gates, ushering the animals toward the covered barn. Eleanor stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching him work. She'd seen storms roll through these hills before, but something in the air tonight felt different. Charged, ominous. Inside, she locked the shutters and gathered candles. Caleb sat on the floor with his bear carving clutched tightly. "Will the roof hold, Mama?" he asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "We've lived through worse." But when the storm broke just after dark, she wasn't so sure. It hit fast and hard. Sheets of rain slammed the earth. Lightning carved the sky open in jagged white flashes, followed by thunder that shook the walls. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the old ranch house groaned under its weight. Eleanor had just finished tucking Caleb into bed when the pain hit a deep, aching pressure behind her eyes, followed by sudden chills. She staggered to the wash basin and splashed water on her face. Her skin was burning. Her hands trembled. By the time she made it to her bedroom, her knees gave out. The fever took her fast, hot, disorienting, and brutal. She collapsed onto the bed, her body racked with cold sweats. Her thoughts spiraled, memories tangled with hallucinations. She saw Jonathan's face, then her father's, then flames, blood, and wind. She called out, not knowing to whom. Taza heard her cry over the roar of the storm. He didn't knock. He simply stepped through the front door, rain dripping from his shoulders. Caleb stood at the top of the stairs, pale and clutching the railing. "Mama's sick," the boy whispered. She was shaking. Taza went to her room. The scent of sweat and sickness was thick in the air. Eleanor thrashed under the covers, mumbling names, lost in fevered dreams. Her hair clung to her cheeks. Her lips were cracked. Taza sat beside her and dipped a cloth in cool water, pressing it gently to her forehead. She flinched at first, then stilled. He stayed there all night. By morning, the storm had passed, but Eleanor hadn't. Taza continued tending to her while keeping the ranch running. He fed Caleb, mended a section of collapsed fence, checked the livestock, then returned to Eleanor's bedside. He gave her water in small spoonfuls and changed the sheets. Never once did he complain. Never once did he leave her alone. In her fevered haze, she sometimes whispered to him, calling him John, reaching for hands that weren't there. Once she opened her eyes and murmured, "Don't leave me again." And Taza, his voice barely audible, replied, "I won't." It was 2 days before the fever broke. Eleanor woke to find him asleep in a chair beside her bed, arms crossed, his body still and quiet like a mountain. The window was open, and sunlight filtered through the curtains. Birds chirped outside. She tried to sit up, but the weakness in her limbs forced her back down. Her throat was dry. "Water," she rasped. Taza stirred instantly, rising to help her sip from a cup. Their eyes met. Hers were rimmed with exhaustion. His held a quiet relief. "You stayed?" she whispered. He nodded. "You needed someone." She blinked slowly. "I dreamed of Jonathan, but it was your hand I held." A long silence stretched between them. The weight of it felt like something fragile, dangerous to disturb. "I'm sorry," she added, not sure what for. For being weak? For being alone? For relying on him? Taza shook his head. "You don't have to be sorry." He stood to leave, but her fingers caught his wrist. "Don't. Go," she said. Her voice broke, not from fever, but from something older. Something lonely. He sat again. This time closer. Her eyes searched his face. And then, slowly, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft, more a breath than a kiss. Her lips brushed his with the hesitation of a woman who'd forgotten how to be touched. But he didn't move. Didn't take more than was offered. When she pulled back, her breath caught in her throat. Taza's expression was unreadable. "You're still grieving," he said gently. "Don't kiss me unless you mean it." He stood and walked to the door, pausing once more before stepping into the hallway. Eleanor lay back against the pillow, heart pounding, lips tingling. She stared at the ceiling. She hadn't meant to kiss him, but a part of her wanted to do it again. As the days grew warmer, the ranch began to bloom again, fields turning green, livestock stronger, fences repaired. The storm had stripped away dead branches, but in its wake, something deeper had taken root. Eleanor felt it in the air, in the steady rhythm of hooves on dirt, and in the quiet strength of the man who now walked her land like it had always belonged to him. Taza had resumed his chores as if nothing had changed. But Eleanor hadn't forgotten the kiss. Nor had she forgotten what he said afterward. "Don't kiss me unless you mean it." She meant it. Or maybe she wanted to mean it. But now she wasn't sure if she'd kissed him because she was weak or because she was lonely. Or because she was beginning to feel something she couldn't yet name. At supper, he still sat at the far end of the table, quiet and watchful. Caleb chattered about everything he learned that day, how Taza showed him where the deer bedded down near the creek, how he'd learned to spot a hawk before it dove for prey. Eleanor watched them with a mix of joy and trepidation. She hadn't just brought a man into their home. She had given her son someone to look up to, and that made everything far more dangerous. Later that week, Eleanor rode into town for supplies. As she walked through the general store, she felt eyes on her, too many of them. Conversations hushed as she passed. She kept her chin high, her stride steady, refusing to acknowledge the murmurs. Stray dog living in her barn. One woman whispered behind her back, "I heard he's Apache." Big one too? Sleeping under her roof like a husband. Shameful. At the counter, Daniel Crowther leaned casually, tapping the handle of his polished cane. Once a suitor of Eleanor's, Daniel had returned from the East a wealthier, colder version of himself. He eyed her with a smug smile. "I hear you've taken in a savage," he said. "A giant one, no less." "Doesn't look good, Eleanor." She kept her voice even. "You've always worried more about appearances than character." Daniel's grin soured. "I could offer you real help. Buy out the land, let you rest. Give your son a future." She raised her chin. "We already have one." Crowther leaned in, lowering his voice. That man, he'll ruin you. The town won't forgive it. And your boy, he'll grow up caught between blood and shame. Eleanor stared at him, fire sparking behind her eyes. Get off my land, Daniel, and don't come back. Back at the ranch, the air hung heavy with heat. Taza had stripped off his shirt, chopping wood in the yard with rhythmic precision. Eleanor watched from the porch, trying to quiet the pounding of her heart. He moved like a man who belonged to the earth, strong, silent, sure. She called out, "Come up when you're done. Supper's almost ready." Later, as the sun dipped below the hills, they sat together on the steps. Caleb was already asleep, and the land was quiet, save for the distant cry of a coyote. Eleanor broke the silence first. "You knew they'd talk, didn't you?" Taza didn't look at her. "They always talk. About people who don't belong. I could lose everything, just for letting you stay." He nodded. "I know." She turned toward him. "Then why are you still here?" His voice was low, but sure. "Because I choose to be." He stood slowly and walked a few steps into the Pheon yard, the moonlight outlining his broad frame. "I'll say this once," he said without turning back. "Let me stay. I will never shame you. I will work until I can't move. I'll protect your son like my own. I'll give you more children. If you ask, not because you owe me, but because I want to, just don't send me away." The night wind carried his words, soft and certain. Eleanor didn't reply. Not then, not with words, but she didn't send him away. She watched him walk back to the barn, and for the first time, her house didn't feel haunted. It felt like it was waiting, like something was beginning. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. The ranch breathed easier in the weeks that followed. The air was warmer. The cattle were thriving. And within the house, Eleanor moved with a quiet calm she hadn't felt since Jonathan's death. It was as if the land, long bruised by loss and hardship, was beginning to heal, just as she was. Taza kept his word. He worked from sunup to sundown, never asking for more than a plate of food and a safe place to sleep. He and Caleb grew even closer, and the boy had started calling him Uncle Bear when he thought his mother couldn't hear. But the peace wasn't meant to last. Word had spread in town, and it twisted as it traveled. People didn't just whisper anymore. They spit when her name was mentioned. They said she had taken in a savage, that she was living in sin, that she'd replaced her husband with a brute. Eleanor ignored it. She told herself they were jealous, bitter, small-minded. But deep down, she knew men like Daniel Crowther didn't like being told no. And they especially didn't like being replaced by someone like Taza. That truth arrived one morning in the form of dust on the horizon and hooves beating fast toward the Remington Ranch. Eleanor saw them first, 3 riders, Daniel Crowther at the lead, flanked by 2 rough men with rifles slung across their saddles. She stepped off the porch, gun at her hip, shoulders squared. Taza was in the corral, working a wild stallion. He saw the riders and didn't hesitate. He tossed the rope and started toward the house without a word. Daniel reined in hard, just feet. From Eleanor's porch, his boots hit the dirt with a thud. "I warned you," he said. "You chose wrong." "You're not welcome here," Eleanor replied coldly. "Turn around." The 2 hired men dismounted, eyes sweeping the yard. One spat tobacco. The other grinned at her like a man who'd already decided she was his to take. Daniel ignored her warning. "You think this place is yours to run? You think the law will side with you if we say that Red Devil hurt your boy? Or threatened you?" Eleanor stepped forward. "My son calls him family. That's more than he ever called you." Daniel's jaw clenched. "I'll take this land from you one way or another." Before Eleanor could respond, Taza appeared beside her, silent, steady, deadly calm. Daniel sneered. "There he is." Thought you'd come out growling. You bark louder than you bite, Apache." Taza didn't answer. But he took one step forward, and that was enough. The first man raised his rifle, and the world exploded. The shot missed, but it was enough to turn the quiet into chaos. Taza moved like a bolt of lightning, grabbing Eleanor and pushing her down. Behind the porch rail, the second man fired, but Taza had already charged, covering the distance in seconds. He struck like a bare fist to throat, elbow to jaw, dropping one man with a grunt and spinning to face the other. The rifle clattered to the dirt. The man tried to run, but Taza tackled him hard, slamming him into the earth. Daniel reached for his revolver, hand shaking. "I'll shoot you, savage," he screamed. "I swear to God." But Eleanor was already on her feet, her pistol drawn. She leveled it at Daniel without blinking. "You raise that gun, and I'll bury you beside your lies." Daniel froze, sweat pouring down his face. Sheriff Godwin arrived minutes later, summoned by a ranch hand who'd seen the riders coming. The scene was chaos, one man unconscious, another moaning in the dirt, and Daniel with Eleanor's gun pointed at his heart. The sheriff didn't ask many questions. The hired man had no legal right to be on her land, and Daniel's story crumbled the moment Caleb came running out crying, begging to make sure Uncle Bear wasn't hurt. The sheriff arrested all three intruders and took them into town. That evening, silence settled over the ranch. Taza sat on the porch steps, blood on his knuckles, a bruise swelling along his jaw. Eleanor brought out a basin and gently washed the dirt and blood from his hands. Neither spoke for a long time. When she finished, she sat beside him, her voice soft. "You didn't have to fight for me like that." "I didn't fight for you," he said, voice low. "I fought for what's mine." Eleanor turned to him slowly. "Is that what I am now?" He looked at her, long and steady. "Only if you want to be." She leaned in then, this time not in weakness, but in choice, and kissed him again. Not tentative, not fevered. Real. When they broke apart, she whispered, "I'm tired of pretending I'm not afraid to want you." Taza rested his forehead against hers. "Then don't pretend anymore." The wind carried the scent of earth and sage across the hills, and though blood had been spilled that day, something stronger had been planted. Roots. The spring rains came soft and steady that year, and with them, new life began to spread across the Remington ranch. Grass grew thick across the hills. The cattle fattened. Wildflowers crept up along the fence lines in yellow and violet bursts. The land was healing. So was Eleanor. The fight with Daniel Crowther and his hired thugs had changed things. Not just in the eyes of the town, though gossip still circled like vultures, but in the walls of her home. There was no longer a line between the stranger in the barn and the woman in the big house. That line had been crossed, then erased completely. The night Eleanor chose him. Taza. He was still quiet, still worked from dawn to dusk, still slept lightly, like a man trained to survive, not rest. But now he ate his meals at the table. He tucked Caleb in at night with quiet words and carved figures. He kissed Eleanor's fingers in the morning, brushed the hair from her face in the dark. He was hers now, not in ownership, but in presence. The townspeople noticed. Some turned their faces away when Eleanor rode into town. Others watched her with open judgment, but just a few nodded. A storekeeper offered her the first strawberries of the season, eyes soft. An older woman pressed her hand and whispered, "My husband was a Cherokee scout." Folks talked. They stopped when they saw he never left me. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a start. Eleanor no longer cared about fitting into the box society had carved out for her. She'd spent too long trying to be everything: the perfect wife, the grieving widow, the woman who held her land with iron fists and smiled through loneliness. Now, she was just Eleanor. And she was in love One morning she stood at the edge of the pasture, watching Taza and Caleb working together. The boy held the reins of a young horse while Taza adjusted the saddle. Caleb's voice was high and excited, asking questions, laughing. Taza, as always, was patient. Eleanor pressed a hand to her stomach. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even Taza, but she knew. Her body knew. There was life inside her again. At first, the realization had brought a kind of fear she hadn't felt. Since Jonathan died, she remembered the pain of childbirth, the long nights, the worry, the loss. But then she had remembered something else, the joy of holding a tiny hand, of watching her son's first smile, and now she was going to feel that again, with Taza. That evening, after dinner, she asked Taza to walk with her. The stars were sharp and clear overhead, the wind warm as it moved through the grass. They walked in silence at first, past the cottonwood tree where Jonathan was buried, past the barn, toward the creek where the water whispered over stones like it held secrets. Eleanor stopped, her hands clasped in front of her. "I want to tell you something," she said. Taza turned to her, waiting. "I'm with child." His eyes widened just slightly, but he didn't speak. "I wasn't sure at first," she continued. "I waited, but now I know. I feel it. I feel her." Taza stepped forward slowly. His hand rose and rested over her stomach, large and warm and reverent. "She's ours." Eleanor whispered, "Not part of a deal, not a promise, just ours." Taza nodded, his voice low and thick. "I will raise her with pride." "I know," she said, tears in her eyes. "And I want you to know something else." He looked into her eyes. "I love you, Taza, not because you stayed, not because you saved me, but because when I had nothing left to give, you didn't take you. Gave." His hands rose to her face, rough palms cradling her gently. He kissed her then, slow and deep, and the wind around them quieted like it knew something sacred was happening. In the weeks that followed, Taza built a cradle by hand, carving wildflowers into the headboard and tiny bears along the base. Caleb helped sand the wood, chattering about what he'd teach his baby sister: how to fish, how to track, how to whistle with grass between her thumbs. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching her son, her man, and the future they were building with their bare hands. She smiled, resting one hand on her belly and the other against the doorframe of the home that finally felt full. Love had come not as a whirlwind or a thunderclap, but as seeds planted slowly, tenderly, and with purpose. Now, those seeds had taken root, and they were growing strong. Summer bloomed across the plains, golden and warm. The days stretched long and full, and the Remington Ranch thrived under the steady care of its new family. But more than the land, it was the people who changed the most, shaped not by what they'd lost, but by what they were building together. Eleanor, once worn thin by grief and responsibility, now moved through her home with a gentler strength. Her steps slower, her body rounded with new life. She carried a glow that hadn't been there in years. Her eyes softened when she watched Caleb play, and lit with a quiet joy when Taza entered the room. Taza remained the pillar of the ranch, quiet, vigilant, dependable. He mended fences, hauled water, trained horses, and built additions to the barn. But he also carved toys for Caleb, held Eleanor's aching back after long days, and sang softly in Apache to her belly at night. The house had changed, too. It wasn't just the new cradle tucked in beside Eleanor's bed or the fresh flowers she placed on the windowsill. It was the way the silence was no longer lonely, it was peaceful, safe, full of shared looks, of the scrape of spoons and bowls, of Caleb's laughter echoing down the hall. The house felt like home now. Not Jonathan's home, theirs. Townsfolk still whispered, Some couldn't believe the rich widow had taken in an Apache not just as help, but as a husband in all but name. A few even stopped doing business with her, their prejudice outweighing their respect. But Eleanor didn't bend. When a neighbor, Mr. Langley, made a cutting remark about savages at the general store, Eleanor turned to him with a level gaze and said, "If being kind, loyal, and decent makes Taza a savage, then we could use more of them." She left the store without buying a thing, but the next day, another rancher sent word he'd be happy to trade her grain for cattle feed. Quiet support, but real. She didn't need everyone, just the right ones. Late one night, a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked across the hills and rain beat against the windows. Caleb crept into Eleanor's room, trembling, and crawled into bed beside her. Taza followed moments later, a lantern in hand, checking the walls, the barn, the roof. When he returned, soaked and windblown, Eleanor reached for him. He climbed into bed beside them, wrapping an arm around them both. The little family huddled together, warm beneath the quilts as the wind howled outside, and then Eleanor gasped. Pain bloomed through her abdomen like lightning. "It's time," she whispered. The labor was long. The storm raged all day and into the night, and Eleanor gritted her teeth through every wave of pain. Taza stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering calming words in Apache and English alike. Caleb stood in the doorway, eyes wide, clutching his little carved bear. The midwife, a kind woman who had traveled through rain and mud to reach the ranch, moved quickly and without panic. And finally, after what felt like a lifetime, a new cry pierced the air. A baby girl. Taza wept. Eleanor laughed, exhausted and radiant, as Taza placed the baby in her arms. Tiny, pink, with a full head of dark hair and her mother's mouth, the child looked up and blinked, already watching the world she'd entered. "She's perfect," Eleanor whispered. "We'll call her Sala." Taza's voice broke. "That means blessing." Life after the birth slowed in the most beautiful ways. Taza took over more work on the ranch, refusing to let Eleanor lift anything heavier than a teacup. Caleb became a protective older brother, showing Sala his toys and promising to teach her everything he knew eventually. Visitors came by with cautious congratulations. Some brought pies, others blankets. A few apologized for what they'd once sighed. One rancher's wife said quietly, "You've made something good here. Real good." And one morning, as the sun rose gold and bright over the horizon, Taza stood outside with Sala in his arms, wrapped in a blanket Eleanor had stitched with wildflower embroidery. Caleb leaned against his side, half asleep. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, a mug in her hands, watching her family framed by the light. Taza turned to her, his voice quiet. "You gave me more than work. You gave me a home." Eleanor stepped down and kissed him. "I didn't give you anything," she said. "You built this with me." Years later, they would tell the story to their daughter how a giant Apache once begged a rich widow to let him stay and work, and how she let him do so much more. She let him stay. She let him love. And together, they raised something stronger than land or money or reputation. They raised a family, and they made a home that would stand the test of time.